So designing with and for urban soils is what I'd like to talk about today. And I'll talk briefly to give a bit of background, a little bit of a theoretical frame, which, as I said, is sort of a large part of how I entered the subject of soil originally with my students in studios. I'll show a little bit of student work and then share some of the research that I was doing at the artist residency recently at the Urban Soils Institute and talk about next steps and where I hope this work can go. Okay, first, in the environmental humanities, it's just lively territory for discussion about climate change and the Anthropocene, as many refer to it. And also there are some amazing pieces on soil and carbon that have really sort of formed my thinking in this area. A couple of things I'd like to cite here just to set us up for this conversation today. One is a work by Nicholas Bouret about counting carbon and really about the problem of the sort of quantitative nature of climate change discourse. And I guess I should mention that I sort of found my way to soils through questioning how landscape architects can better engage climate change, not just in preparing for sea level rise, which is done quite a lot, but also in seeing how we can do more land-based sequestration. And Bouret is critical of this sort of technocratic approach, as there's good reason to be, and a lot of theorists are writing about this problem in the environmental humanities. And Bouret proposes that climate change discourse, the problem that we have with it is that it's a shared envisioning framework that binds the calculative logic of climate change science to the hierarchical orderings of globalization, where the local is always subordinated to global processes and projects. Right, we're always thinking climate change at this scale that is so massive and so linked to governmental action, so linked to industrial production that it's very difficult to find a way in, especially at the local scale. And so Bouret asks, what if the problem with climate change is the problem itself, in the sense that the problem sets us up, sets many of us humans up, unable to solve it, right? It's an unsolvable problem on some level. And he also asks, is it possible to make climate change speak otherwise? So I also wanted to set us up with a couple words from Jennifer Gabrys, who has a lovely piece, Sink the Dirt of Systems, where she talks about waste and carbon and the challenges of conceiving of carbon as waste. And she really tries to reach beyond in that piece, the notion that atmospheric carbon is just a waste, in need of a sink, right? That it's that simple, we just have to put it somewhere other than in the atmosphere. And she works in this piece to really sort of enliven our relationship with matter in a certain way so that we can maybe think it otherwise and find other approaches to it. And she suggests that when matter is active, it spills across boundaries. It activates us toward natural cultural orientations that are not so much about tidying up as about cultivating a more thorough engagement with the indeterminate environment in which we are embedded. So I'd like to take these two things forward in these few minutes here and sort of flag these questions and ideas. Is it possible to make climate change speak otherwise? And how can we go about cultivating a more thorough engagement with the indeterminate environment in which we are embedded? So for me, both of those questions have become very much about soil and about engaging soil in the urban context, and specifically about how designers might do that better. Okay, a little bit of student work here. So a couple of these images are from a studio, the first studio I taught on soils in 2017. And the students, we actually worked in Little Ithaca, New York. This was at Cornell University, thinking about how we might, how the students might engage landscape to create initiatives and projects and activities that simultaneously worked on improving soil carbon relations in some way and improving the sequestration of carbon in some way, and also did that in a public sense, in a way that actually made the very subject more available to this community. And one of those projects was a sort of the waste shop, as my student imagined it, which was an addition to the local skate park that would actually be a sort of workshop space, a recycling space that was also a cultural space and a workshop space that would fold composting activities in with actually the processing of glass and of plastic and of paper and a whole series of events. Another student focused more technically on what it would be to actually implement a biochar production and use at the municipal scale system into Ithaca, and looked at circular economies as a sort of model for how one might do that, and was sort of thinking about the movement of the materials and how it might be economically feasible. More recently, I've had students at Montreal exploring soils in that city, and just sort of conceptually still at this sort of broad ideal level. We did soil portraits in that class, and you see one of those on the left here. And students came up with questions such as written here in French, but how to prioritize the movement of subterranean biodiversity in the city. So they had some kind of right questions that they found. And some beautiful work. The soil portraits often were very full of life in certain really lovely ways. But when we got to sections, there was a sort of a loss of, I think, sense of agency for the students in terms of how to deal with the actual soil in the actual city, right? So we have these ideas, we have these programmatic ideas that emerge, these sort of cultural ideas, but when it actually got down to figuring out like, okay, well, how do we do this, right? What do we actually do? And I think it was really clear in their drawings that there was a lack of understanding of what was actually happening down there. And I really struggled to help them fill that in as well in a lot of ways. I had pieces and I had more knowledge than they did at that point, but still so many questions. And they were up against a lot. I mean, we have the design professions have a tendency to treat soil space as blank space in the first place. So they were trying to fill in what they knew was empty space. We had scant data in a way. We had some data, but more questions than answers. And then there's this extremely high variability in the city, not knowing on this specific alley what is underneath. And so we kept ending up with drawings like these, where we have sort of the same root image used for many different kinds of plants. This is a ruelle. It's a back alley, basically, in Montreal, in the middle of the block. And there are utilities there, but we don't really know where the utilities are. It was paved. There's no notion exactly of what it would be to rip up the pavement and transform that soil into something more rich. So many things just unopened, so many aspects unopened. So that issue has sort of gotten me to this place of asking, how can designers of the urban environment visualize interrelations between soils, carbon, and climate in ways that enable new comprehension of their extraordinary complexity and new actions towards more lively urban terrains? And I asked this with an eye on design innovation, drawing better to do better, and also towards greater public engagement. How can we actually use showing as a way to communicate what's happening under the ground in the city? Okay, a quick glimpse at work in progress. And I know I have 10 minutes and the ticker is counting, so I'll do this briefly. While I was at the Urban Soils Institute, I did a little bit of this work, which I talked about previously, which is very much modeling work, a bunch of sediments in jars and mixing them up and looking what happens. It's sort of an aesthetics of exchange, of transformation, of senescence, things sort of shift and settle and move and transform. And it feels very connected to soils and climate for me as a practice. And at the same time, I was sort of digging in and researching. I spent a lot of time with this poster and with the soils on the tables and all the material in that room, just sort of starting to unpack and understand everything, all the extraordinary information embedded here. And read some materials and have started to come out with a series of principles, right? Or a bit of knowledge in terms of some bits of information out of the scientific literature that can be mobilized towards some design action. I know that now that unsealed urban soils in Paris and New York City have really high carbon stocks. comparable to rural forests, better than nearby agriculture. I understand that sealing kills soils, but holds carbon pretty well. And that urban microbiomes in Central Park, for example, are really diverse. And this is just this sort of beginning, right? So as you see, I've written, I have an open invitation to tell me more. I'm looking to learn more. And I've sort of started to set up some next steps. So two of these things, sort of where I am now with this is to work on expanding the design drawing toolkit to think about different ways to draw that start to open up that underground space. And I can sort of share with you the early scribbles on that, right? One of those is to go from this predominant design notion of these sort of pockets of soil within the city that sit isolated, right? When we design a tree well, it's a box in a sort of blank space, even in the construction drawing, right? So there's not a consideration of how it necessarily is meshed into the rest of the terrain. And there's a need to go from this sort of pocket notion to a deeper understanding of the extensiveness of that terrain, and to start drawing it that way, and not to let that space be blank. And another way I'm sort of thinking about this is flipping the section, right? Another example of this in the design professions. Here's a typical section that would be created to present a design project. We're not at construction documentation yet, but you see what's missing, right? There's the space beneath the section line completely blank. And in a way, I think what we need to do next is to flip that section and to think as deeply and richly about that underground terrain and the relationships there as we are accustomed to thinking as designers about the relationships above. And then I'm pulling material together and from different fields and different corners that to see if I can sort of work them together into one sort of design sectional drawing of terrain. So the soil profile is one, and then some of these older soil profiles that were hand drawn are actually much closer to a design sensibility where I can think, oh, this is how we could draw some of that data that is more photographic today. Deep root diagrams of plants are extraordinary and feel very relevant here. And so to bring some of that together with that, and then to also bring in that glimpsing and making sense of the utilities under the street, right? And what is actually happening under the sealed parts of soil to make better sense of that. And then of course the geologic pieces. And so this is the drawing that I'm now sort of starting to stick up on my wall and try to make sense of a somewhat extensive cross section over a couple of city blocks and into an adjacent park, and see what happens when we start packing this stuff together as a sort of design drawing, if you will. And I'm a little over time, so I'm going to stop there actually. Well, that's a good place to quit. Go back. Okay, thanks.
If I may, Margaret, I would add that one other slide that you had coming up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm sort of conscious that I've talked too long. I knew I would. There is one more. There's sort of next steps, but I'm not there, and I have nothing to show about them yet. But what I'd like, I think these are in question because they're out another layer. But what I'd really like to do eventually is to sort of build out a design guide for landscape architects, and perhaps a resource for city governments, right? Which has principles, guidelines, and practices for designing for soils. And that's sort of that's like out there a little ways at the moment. But what needs to come before that is much more collaboration and sort of even testing of ideas, right? Like, oh, so what if designers were to approach soils this way, and to bring that to soil scientists and to people working in conservation and local parks, and to talk with landscape architects, say, is this feasible, and what can actually work? And I think a lot of that needs to be done in this case. And exploring methods for engaging publics is another piece that I think needs its space in any of these conversations these days. So those are the kind of tantalizingly out further pieces I was going to mention as well. And I think, did I